They say you know when you've found the one, that there's this moment of clarity, a kind of certainty that grips you like a hand squeezing your heart. I felt that the first time I saw her. It was at a party, one I almost didn't go to because I was tired from work. But there she was, laughing under the dim lights, her eyes bright and magnetic. And just like that, my world shifted. Our connection was instant, electric. In those early days, we were inseparable. She'd laugh at my terrible jokes, lean into me as we shared stories, her fingers trailing absently over mine. Every day felt like a gift, each moment charged with the thrill of discovering someone who seemed to fit perfectly with every hidden part of me. We'd talk until the early hours, planning futures that felt limitless, promises whispered under stars, dreams shared like secrets. On our wedding day, she looked at me with a kind of adoration that made everything else in the world fall away. She was my beginning, my middle, my end, the one I would build my life around. I can still remember the feel of her hand in mine as we said our vows, her smile as she promised to be my partner through everything life would throw at us. And for a long time, I believed we were exactly that, partners, soulmates. We built our lives together brick by brick, moment by moment. Lazy Sundays became sacred, our small routines a comfort I never took for granted. Every "I love you" felt like an anchor, rooting me in the knowledge that I'd found something real, something lasting. Our friends would say we were the perfect couple, that we had something rare, and I'd laugh, thinking how lucky I was that they were right. But looking back, I wonder if I was too caught up in the dream, too invested in this image of us to see the truth slipping through the cracks. I miss things, small things that seemed unimportant at the time, things that on their own felt like nothing but with her were everything. She'd brush them off, and I'd ignore that whisper of doubt, that quiet tug at the back of my mind, convincing myself I was just overthinking. After all, who questions the love of their life? But I should have. The change was so gradual that I barely noticed it. Or maybe I didn't want to. I'd wake up one day and feel a faint distance, a sense of something shifting, like a current pulling us apart beneath the surface. She'd come home later, shrugging off my questions with that dazzling smile. "Just work," she'd say, and I'd believe her because why wouldn't I? This was my wife, my person, the woman who once couldn't go a few hours without texting me something sweet, something to remind me that I was hers and she was mine. Now, I wish I could say that I'd paid closer attention, that I'd listened to that quiet voice in my head warning me, telling me that things weren't as perfect as they seemed. But I was so sure of her, so certain that what we had was untouchable, that I never even saw it coming. Looking back, the signs were everywhere, each one building on the last, each one pulling her further away from me. The life we shared, the love we'd promised each other, was slipping through my fingers, and I had no idea how much of it was a lie. And so here I am, wondering how I could have been so blind, asking myself where I went wrong, replaying every word, every touch, every look that might have hidden something darker. All those nights we spent laughing, dreaming, promising each other forever. Were they real, or just another part of the illusion? I thought I knew her, thought I knew the woman I'd vowed my life to. But the truth is, she was a stranger all along, living a life I never saw coming. And that's what keeps me up at night. The signs I missed, the betrayal that blindsided me, and the sinking realization that the life I'd built with her was nothing more than a beautifully crafted lie. It wasn't all at once the way things started to change. If anything, it was so subtle that at first I didn't notice a thing. It started with small adjustments in her routine, staying a bit later at work, claiming last-minute projects that required weekend hours. She worked in marketing, and while her schedule had its busy seasons, there had always been a rhythm to it, a predictability. But now things felt different. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was overthinking something insignificant. After all, who questions the person they trust most? But the changes kept coming. She started spending more time on her phone, always holding it close, quick to flip the screen down when I walked into the room. I never used to think twice about it. We both had our privacy, and I respected that. Yet now, I felt a strange unease, as though there were parts of her day that were becoming inaccessible, doors quietly closing in a home we'd once shared completely. There were the nights when she'd suddenly announce plans with work friends. Friends I'd never met. Friends who, somehow, had started becoming regular parts of her social life, despite her never mentioning them before. I'd ask a question or two, where they were going if she wanted me to join, and she'd smile that easy smile, shake her head, and say something like, "Oh, it's just a girls' night." Nothing exciting. In the beginning, I let it slide. She was allowed to have her own friends, her own life. But over time, I noticed she never offered much detail. When I'd ask how her night was, she'd reply with a vague "good." Nothing much happened, then pivot to ask about my day. It was as if there was a wall being built between us, brick by brick, and I was starting to feel the separation. One night, I tried to be supportive, offering to drive her and pick her up. She gave a quick, nervous laugh and waved off the idea, saying something about how it'd be silly to make me wait up for her. It seemed innocent enough, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was pulling away from me, slipping through my fingers, becoming someone I couldn't reach. The intimacy between us began to fade, replaced by a subtle, uncomfortable distance. She'd spend more time in front of the mirror, put extra care into her appearance for her work events. She'd spritz on a new perfume that was rich and alluring, a scent I didn't recognize. When I commented on it, she shrugged and said it was just something she'd picked up on sale. But there was something different in the way she dressed, the extra effort that felt like it wasn't meant for me. I tried to push these feelings down, to ignore the quiet voice in my mind that told me something was wrong. I told myself I was paranoid, that I was overreacting. She'd always been kind, thoughtful, loyal. She'd been the one person I could trust with everything, the one I could count on no matter what. I forced myself to hold on to that belief, to keep going, because the idea of her being anything but honest with me felt like an impossibility. Yet, there were moments when I'd catch her looking at me, a strange, unreadable expression flickering across her face. It was almost as if she was carrying a secret, something she couldn't tell me, something that weighed on her. But just as quickly, that look would vanish, and she'd return to her usual, smiling self. At night, as we lay in bed, I'd watch her fall asleep beside me, my heart heavy with questions I was too afraid to ask. I wanted so desperately to believe that everything was fine, that these shifts were just the natural ebb and flow of a long-term relationship. I'd tell myself that she was busy, that work was demanding, that it was normal for two people to drift a little from time to time. But deep down, I knew that something had changed between us, something I couldn't ignore forever. And yet I ignored it anyway, because facing the truth meant risking the life we'd built, and I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. The turning point came on a day that felt like any other. We were in the kitchen, making dinner together, our usual ritual after a long day. She was chopping vegetables, humming softly to herself, and I was stirring a pot of pasta. It was one of those simple moments that I cherished, a reminder of the normalcy we'd built together. But then, her phone buzzed on the counter, and something shifted. Without thinking, I glanced at the screen. Just one word illuminated there: tonight. No other context, no accompanying details. Just tonight. And it was from a name I didn't recognize, a man's name, one that wasn't connected to any of her usual work contacts or friends. For a brief second, I felt my stomach drop, the quiet alarm ringing in my mind. She noticed my glance, almost instantly moving to cover the phone with her hand. I tried to act casual, not wanting to seem accusatory. "Everything okay?" I asked, forcing a smile. "Oh yeah, just work stuff," she said quickly, smiling back a little too brightly, a little too easily. She turned her attention back to chopping the vegetables, her hand gripping the knife with a tension that I hadn't seen before. And for the rest of the evening, she seemed distant, as though her mind was somewhere far away, somewhere I wasn't allowed to follow. I tried to shake it off, rationalizing that the message could have meant anything. I didn't want to jump to conclusions over a single word. But still, tonight echoed in my mind, refusing to let go, a constant reminder that something was slipping through my fingers. The more I thought about it, the more questions began to form. Why would someone text her so late for work stuff? And why had she reacted so defensively, so quickly, as if she was hiding something? I told myself to let it go, that I was being paranoid. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it was growing, feeding off every little inconsistency, every unanswered question. Over the next few days, I found myself watching her more closely, noticing things I might have missed before. She was spending more time on her phone, texting with a focus I hadn't seen in a while. And every now and then, she'd disappear into the other room to take a call, closing the door behind her. It was something she never used to do. We'd always been open about our calls, our messages. There had never been a need to hide anything. One evening, as we were watching a movie, her phone buzzed again. She glanced at it, then quickly placed it face down on the coffee table. The gesture was so subtle, yet so telling. I tried to ignore it, but my mind was racing. I wanted to ask her, to demand to know what was going on, but something held me back. Maybe it was fear of hearing an answer I wasn't ready for. A few days later, I couldn't hold it in any longer. I decided to casually ask her about the message, pretending it was nothing, just a fleeting curiosity. We were out for dinner, and I brought it up as casually as I could manage. "That message you got the other night, you look like you were surprised. Was everything okay?" She paused, her fork frozen in midair, her eyes widening ever so slightly. But then, just as quickly, she recovered, laughing it off. "Oh, that? Yeah, it was just a work thing," she said, her voice a bit too cheerful. "One of the clients needed some last-minute help. You know how it is." I nodded, forcing a smile, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that she was lying. Her answer had been too quick, too rehearsed, as though she'd already prepared herself for my question. And just like that, the evening felt tainted, a strange silence settling between us. That night, as I lay in bed beside her, I felt a strange hollowness gnawing at me. I wanted to believe her, to trust that what she'd said was the truth. But the doubt kept creeping back, whispering that something wasn't right, that the woman lying next to me was hiding something from me. The next morning, I caught myself reaching for her phone while she was in the shower, my hand hovering over the screen, my heart pounding. But I pulled back, feeling a wave of guilt wash over me. This was the woman I'd promised to trust, to love unconditionally. Snooping through her phone felt like a betrayal of that trust. And yet, wasn't she the one betraying me? In the end, I left her phone where it was, telling myself that if something were truly wrong, it would come to light on its own. But as I left the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd missed my chance, that I was letting something slip through my grasp, something that would soon spiral out of my control. And as the days passed, I felt that hollow feeling grow, an empty pit of suspicion that I couldn't ignore, no matter how hard I tried. As time went on, that single message, "Tonight," began to echo through every interaction we had. Each smile, each laugh, even each word she spoke seemed tainted by a hint of something hidden, something I wasn't meant to know. And the more I thought about it, the more other moments came rushing back to me, moments that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now felt ominous. I noticed her habits shifting in ways I couldn't explain. She used to text me during her lunch break, simple things like, "Miss you," or "Can't wait to get home." But those texts had become scarce. Sometimes I'd send her a message, and hours would go by before she'd reply with a short, dismissive answer. When I asked her about it, she'd brush it off, blaming the chaos of her workload. "It's just a busy time," she'd say, that easy smile of hers putting up an invisible wall between us. The physical distance between us grew too. She started staying later at the office, saying she had projects to wrap up, clients needing more time. A small part of me understood. Work could be demanding, deadlines relentless. But this wasn't the woman I knew. The woman I married had always balanced work and home, priding herself on leaving the office stress behind her. And yet, here she was slipping away for hours, sometimes whole evenings, without so much as a text. One night, I found a receipt on the kitchen counter, just a simple slip of paper, crumpled, almost forgotten. It was for a bar on the other side of town, a place I'd never heard of before. I picked it up, staring at the name, trying to imagine her there. The receipt showed a charge for 2 cocktails and an appetizer. My stomach twisted as I realized that this wasn't just some work-related dinner or a quick coffee with a friend. She'd been out sharing drinks and food with someone. And it wasn't me. When she came home that night, I tried to play it cool. I asked her about her evening, hoping she'd bring it up on her own. She laughed, shrugging, and told me about how boring her night had been, how she just grabbed a quick bite after work. But she didn't mention the bar. She didn't mention the receipt. I asked her, my voice as calm as I could make it. I found this in the kitchen. Did you go to some new bar tonight? She froze for just a second, a brief flicker of something dark crossing her face before she composed herself. Oh, that? Yeah. I grabbed a drink with my boss, she said, too quickly. We were wrapping up a project, and he offered to take me out for a quick bite to celebrate. Nothing special. Her answer hung in the air, a little too rehearsed, her tone too casual. I wanted to believe her. I wanted so desperately to take her words at face value, to dismiss the nagging feeling that she was lying to me. But as she moved away, busying herself with something on the counter, I caught her glancing at her phone, her fingers drumming on the surface in a way that felt restless, almost nervous. The days that followed were a whirlwind of subtle shifts. Each one seemed small in isolation, but together, they painted a picture I didn't want to see. She began dressing differently, paying more attention to her appearance. She bought new clothes, stylish, more elegant than her usual work attire. When I commented on it, she laughed it off, saying she just wanted to change things up. But it didn't feel like she was dressing for me. I couldn't shake the feeling that these changes were meant for someone else, someone I didn't know. And then there were the phone calls. It started with her leaving the room more often. She'd answer her phone, glance at me, and say, "Just work stuff, I'll be back." Then she'd close the door, speaking in hushed tones, her voice a muffled hum behind the walls. When she returned, she'd be cheerful, chatty, acting as if nothing were amiss. But I could feel the space between us widening, a silent rift that only I seemed to notice. One night, she took a call that seemed to last forever. I was sitting in the living room, pretending to read, while my mind raced with questions. When she finally emerged, she wore that same practiced smile, the same air of nonchalance that had become all too familiar. "Long call?" I asked, hoping for a straightforward answer, a reassurance. She laughed, her tone airy. "Oh yeah, sorry about that. Just one of those clients who doesn't know when to stop talking. It's nothing really." And that was her favorite phrase lately. It's nothing. Everything was nothing. Every strange receipt, every odd phone call, every new habit was reduced to nothing. But in my mind, it was everything. It was the unraveling of the life we'd built, the first cracks in the foundation of our marriage. And she either didn't notice or didn't care. The doubt was consuming me, a constant, gnawing worry that kept me up at night. I tried to tell myself that she'd never do anything to hurt me, that I was just being paranoid. But each little inconsistency, each unexplained receipt, each guarded look she gave me only added to the weight pressing down on my chest. Finally, I realized that I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to know, had to find out the truth, even if it shattered everything. Because living in this purgatory of doubt was tearing me apart, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could pretend that everything was fine. It was one of those nights when the house felt too big, too empty. She told me she was going out with an old friend from college, someone she hadn't seen in years. Her name was Lydia, she said, and they were planning to catch up over dinner. The story sounded plausible, yet something felt off from the start. When she left, I tried to brush off my unease. But as I sat alone, staring at the quiet spaces around me, I realized I couldn't shake the feeling that this dinner, this Lydia, wasn't real. I wanted to believe her, wanted to trust that this was just my mind playing tricks. But after everything, the secretive phone calls, the guarded smiles, the unexplained absences, I was done pushing my suspicions aside. I tried to picture Lydia, this mysterious friend I'd never met, the one she'd apparently reconnected with after all these years. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't recall her ever mentioning a Lydia before. Surely, in all the stories we'd shared about our lives, she would have mentioned this friend if they were close enough to catch up over dinner. My thoughts spiraled. Had she lied about the entire thing? Was Lydia even real? And if not, then who was she really with tonight? When she finally came home, her cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright with that familiar, easy smile. She seemed happy, carefree, as though she'd had a genuinely good time. And for a brief moment, I questioned everything. Was I overreacting? Was this simply my mind twisting innocent things into something sinister? But I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling any longer. How was dinner? I asked, trying to keep my voice light, casual. Oh, it was great, she said without missing a beat. Lydia's doing so well. She has 2 kids now. Can you believe it? She launched into a story about Lydia's life. How she'd moved to another state. How she was balancing work and motherhood. It all sounded real. Too real, in fact. She went on about Lydia's family, the little quirks of her kids, funny anecdotes that sounded like they were pulled straight from a family dinner. For a second, I felt guilty for doubting her. Maybe I had been overthinking. Maybe this really was just an innocent catch-up with an old friend. But then, I asked a question I hadn't planned, a question that slipped out before I could stop it. What's Lydia's last name again? She hesitated. It was only for a split second, but in that fraction of a moment, her eyes widened just a bit, her fingers tensing around the edge of the countertop. She quickly recovered, but the pause was enough. Parker, she said, too casually. Lydia Parker. You know, from college. She smiled, waiting for me to let it go, but I couldn't. Something about the way she said that name felt wrong, rehearsed, as if she'd practiced it for moments like these. I didn't know any Lydia Parker. She'd never mentioned her before, never brought up stories from college that included this supposed best friend. Lydia Parker, I repeated, nodding slowly. I don't think I remember you ever mentioning her. She laughed, waving it off. Oh, she was a friend from a different group. We didn't hang out that often back then, but we kept in touch. You know how it is. Her answer was smooth, polished, almost as if she'd expected my question. But the more she spoke, the more it sounded like she was filling in blanks, giving me just enough to satisfy my curiosity without any real substance. My heart sank as I listened, realizing that this story wasn't about reconnecting with an old friend. It was a smokescreen, something she'd crafted to cover her tracks. I tried to play along, asking small questions about Lydia's family, her life. Each time, she'd answer with a bright smile and a casual response, as if it were all true. But the more she talked, the more hollow her words sounded, like an actor reciting lines from a poorly written script. And then, she said something that sealed it for me. She actually mentioned you, she said, her voice warm. She remembers when I told her about you back in college. She said she'd love to meet you sometime. A knot formed in my stomach, a sense of dread that made it hard to breathe. Because if Lydia were real, if she truly existed, then why hadn't we met before? Why hadn't she come up in conversation, not even once, in all the years we'd been together? Oh yeah, I replied, keeping my tone steady. That'd be nice. She beamed at me, clearly relieved that I'd let the subject drop, that I wasn't prying any further. She leaned over, kissing me lightly on the cheek, then headed upstairs, leaving me alone in the kitchen, alone with my thoughts. As I stood there, I realized that every part of me wanted to believe her, to believe that this was just an innocent dinner with an old friend. But the cracks in her story were too glaring, too blatant to ignore. Lydia wasn't real, or if she was, she certainly wasn't the person my wife was seeing tonight. I stayed up late, replaying the entire conversation in my mind, dissecting every word, every pause, every glance. It was as if I were trying to solve a puzzle, piecing together fragments of information, each one pointing to a truth I didn't want to face. Eventually, I fell asleep on the couch, my mind a mess of doubts and unanswered questions. And in the morning, when I woke up, I felt like I'd crossed a line, like there was no going back to the way things used to be. The trust between us was fraying, unraveling piece by piece, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could pretend that everything was fine. Because if Lydia wasn't real, if this story was nothing more than a fabrication, then who was my wife really spending her nights with? And as that question echoed in my mind, I realized that I couldn't keep ignoring the truth. The weight of my suspicions grew too heavy to ignore. Every day, every conversation with her became a balancing act. My need for answers against her carefully crafted excuses. I kept hoping for some undeniable proof, something that would force the truth into the open. But all I had were fragments, small inconsistencies that, on their own, didn't add up to much. Yet, together, they painted a picture I couldn't shake. One evening, I decided to confront her. Not directly, no accusations, no anger. Just an innocent, probing question, a test to see if she'd slip up or tell me something different. I waited until after dinner, when we were both in the living room, the usual safe haven where we'd unwind together. She was scrolling through her phone, her face calm, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. "Hey," I started, keeping my tone casual. "Do you need any help with work stuff? I know you've been pretty busy lately with all the new clients and late nights." She looked up, her smile faltering just a little. But then she recovered, giving me that easy, practice laugh I'd come to recognize. "Oh, you wouldn't want to get involved in my work? It's boring," she said, waving it off. "Just a lot of numbers and spreadsheets. Nothing exciting." Her answer was too smooth, too rehearsed, and I felt my chest tighten. "Still, maybe I could help you get some extra time for yourself," I replied, pressing just a little harder. "Seems like you're juggling a lot. I hate seeing you so stressed." Her hand tightened slightly around her phone, and for a split second, I saw something flash in her eyes. Hesitation, maybe even annoyance. But she masked it quickly, giving me that reassuring smile that had once felt so genuine. "I appreciate that, really," she said, her tone gentle. "But it's not necessary. It's just one of those phases. Once I wrap up this project, things will get back to normal. I promise." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, I let myself believe them. Maybe I was overthinking. Maybe I was letting my fears twist innocent things into something they weren't. But the memory of that single word, "tonight," still echoed in my mind, refusing to be silenced. After a long pause, I nodded, trying to appear reassured. "I'm just trying to help. I guess I don't like seeing you so distant." Her smile faltered again, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of frustration in her eyes. "Distant?" she repeated, as though the word were foreign to her. "What do you mean by that?" I felt the words forming, all my pent-up fears and suspicions bubbling to the surface. I wanted to tell her everything, about the phone calls, the late nights, the slip-ups and strange behaviors that had become our new reality. But something held me back, a part of me that still clung to the hope that I was wrong, that all of this was just a misunderstanding. "I don't know," I said finally, my voice softer, almost pleading. "It just feels like you're different lately. Like there's something you're not telling me." She looked at me, her expression softening, and for a moment, I thought I saw a glimmer of guilt. But then she sighed, reaching out to take my hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "I know I've been distracted," she said, her tone sincere. "Work has been a lot lately. It's been taking up way more of my time and energy than I'd like. But that's all it is. I promise." Her hand felt warm in mine, her eyes meeting mine with an intensity that seemed genuine. And for a split second, I felt my resolve weaken, felt myself start to believe her. But then, she pulled away, glancing at her phone as it buzzed with a new notification. The message was quick, a flash of text that disappeared as she flipped her phone over, hiding it from view. "Just another work thing," she said almost too quickly, her smile strained. I didn't respond, letting the silence settle between us, heavy and suffocating. I could see the tension in her posture, the way her fingers tapped restlessly on the arm of the couch. It was as if she were waiting for me to drop the subject, to accept her answer and move on. But I couldn't. Not anymore. "You know," I said slowly, choosing my words carefully, "you used to tell me everything. I miss that." She looked away, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer, almost defensive. "Things change, you know. Work gets demanding, life gets complicated. It's not that I don't want to share things with you. It's just sometimes I need my own space too." Her words cut deeper than she realized, striking at the heart of my doubts. Space. That was what she wanted. Space from me, from the life we'd built together. I felt a chill wash over me, a sense of loss that was almost tangible, as though I were watching our marriage unravel in real time. That night, I lay awake beside her, my mind racing with unanswered questions. I could hear her breathing softly, her face peaceful, as if nothing had changed, as if everything were perfectly normal. But for me, There was no peace, no rest. My thoughts twisted and turned, each one a reminder that the woman beside me was becoming someone I didn't know, someone I couldn't reach. The next morning, I watched her leave for work, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. She kissed me goodbye, her smile just as bright as ever, but it felt hollow, a gesture made out of habit rather than love. And as I stood there, watching her walk out the door, I knew that I couldn't go on like this. The confrontation had only deepened my doubts, her answers doing little to ease the gnawing sense of betrayal that had taken root inside me. She was slipping away, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. All I had were questions, fragments of a truth I wasn't ready to face. But one thing was certain. This was no longer the life we'd once shared. And for the first time, I found myself wondering if it ever had been. The doubts grew louder, refusing to be silenced. Every day felt like a fresh descent into suspicion and frustration. I tried confronting her, tried to catch her in small lies. And yet she evaded every question with a polished answer, a seamless smile, or a deflection that left me more confused than before. But my gut told me the truth I didn't want to admit. She was hiding something, and whatever it was, it had already begun to tear us apart. One night, the nagging feeling became unbearable. She'd left for another work dinner, the kind that now seemed to crop up several times a week. I watched her leave, her silhouette slipping into the night, her perfume lingering in the air. As the door clicked shut, a heavy, suffocating silence settled over the house, each room feeling emptier than the last. I sat alone in our living room, the shadows stretching across the walls, the stillness amplifying every stray thought. I tried to keep myself occupied, flipping through channels on the television, skimming through a book I had no interest in reading. But my eyes kept drifting back to the place where she'd been sitting just moments before, her warmth now replaced by a hollow absence. After what felt like hours, I found myself standing in our bedroom, staring at her laptop sitting innocently on her desk. My heart pounded, the weight of what I was about to do pressing down on me like a physical force. I told myself that this was my last resort, my only chance at finding answers. I needed to know the truth, even if it shattered me. I moved toward the desk, my hands trembling as I opened the laptop. Her password had never changed. It was still the same combination of letters and numbers she'd shown me years ago. I felt a pang of guilt as I typed it in, the faintest echo of trust that was quickly smothered by my desperation. The screen lit up, and I found myself staring at her desktop, an array of files and folders that seemed both familiar and foreign. I navigated to her email, scrolling through the list of messages with a sense of dread. Most were work-related, mundane exchanges about projects and deadlines. But as I scrolled further down, I found a conversation thread with a name I didn't recognize, a name that didn't match any of her co-workers or friends. I clicked on it, my pulse quickening as I skimmed through the messages. The exchange was brief, but unmistakable. There were dinner plans, hotel reservations, even small, flirtatious notes that left no room for misinterpretation. Each word felt like a blow, a cold, brutal confirmation of everything I'd feared. I scrolled further, each message adding another layer to my heartbreak. I could feel my world crumbling, the life we'd built reduced to empty promises and broken trust. As I read through the final message, I realized I'd been gripping the edge of the desk so tightly that my knuckles had turned white. I released my grip, my hands trembling as I shut the laptop, the weight of the betrayal pressing down on me. I could hardly breathe, my chest tight with a mixture of anger, sorrow, and disbelief. I stumbled back, sinking onto the edge of the bed, my mind reeling. The woman I'd loved, the woman I'd trusted more than anyone in the world, had been living a life I knew nothing about. The secrets, the lies, the late nights. They were all part of a carefully constructed facade, a mask that had slipped just enough for me to catch a glimpse of the truth. My thoughts spiraled, each one a fresh wound, a reminder of the love I'd lost. I thought about our early days, the promises we'd made, the life we'd dreamed of sharing. Every memory felt tainted now, Every shared moment soured by the realization that it had all been a lie. I stayed there for hours, lost in a haze of grief and confusion, the silence of the house pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't escape. Eventually, I heard her footsteps approaching, the faint click of her heels against the floor as she walked toward the bedroom. I knew I should confront her, demand answers, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I was too tired, too broken to face her lies again. The door opened, and she stepped inside, her face lighting up with a smile that felt more like a mask than ever before. She greeted me with that same easy charm, the same warmth that had once made me feel like the luckiest man alive. But now, all I saw was deception, a cold reminder of the truth I'd uncovered. "Hey," she said, her voice soft, as if nothing had changed. I forced a smile, nodding in response, my mind numb, my heart hollow. I didn't have the strength to confront her, to demand an explanation. All I wanted was to escape the nightmare I'd found myself in, to wake up from this twisted reality and find that everything had been a bad dream. But as I watched her move around the room, her laughter filling the silence, I knew that there was no escaping the truth. The life we'd shared was gone, replaced by a hollow shell of lies and broken promises. And as much as I wanted to pretend, to cling to the hope that somehow, some way, we could find our way back, I knew that the woman standing before me was no longer the person I'd loved. She was a stranger, and I was alone. The hours that followed were a blur of anger, disbelief, and hollow emptiness. I spent most of the night in a fog, alternating between restless pacing and moments where I'd just stare into the silence, trying to process the weight of what I'd uncovered. My mind couldn't stop replaying those messages, those damning words, and every time I did, I felt another piece of me break. By morning, I knew I couldn't keep pretending, couldn't continue to live in the same house with this mounting lie between us. Something inside me had finally reached its limit. I'd hoped I could piece the truth together, that the fragments would be enough to confront her in a calm, measured way. But as I stood there, the betrayal still fresh in my mind, I knew there would be no calm way to confront this. It was time for the truth, raw and exposed. I waited for her in the kitchen, where the morning light slanted through the windows, casting harsh shadows on everything it touched. She walked in, her usual lightheartedness replaced with a cautious glance in my direction. Perhaps she could sense that something was different, that this was not just another morning. "Good morning," she said hesitantly, her voice tinged with forced cheer. I didn't reply. I just watched her, letting the silence fill the room, letting her feel the weight of my gaze. Slowly, her smile faded, replaced by a wary look as she set her coffee cup down on the counter, her eyes meeting mine. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I took a deep breath, steadying myself before I spoke. "Who is he?" The words came out cold, harsher than I'd intended. But I didn't regret it. I needed her to feel the weight of what she'd done, the pain she'd caused. Her face paled, and for a moment, she looked like she'd been caught in a trap. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, she took a step back, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the counter. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice faltering. I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. "Don't lie to me. I saw the messages, the reservations. I know everything." Silence filled the room, stretching out painfully as she stared at me, her eyes wide with shock. And in that moment, I saw the mask slip. The polished, practiced expression she'd worn like armor crumbled, leaving behind something raw and vulnerable, a glimpse of the truth she'd been hiding for so long. For a brief second, I saw something that looked like regret flash across her face. But just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by a steely resolve as she straightened up, her expression hardening. "So, she said quietly, her voice barely more than a whisper. The admission was like a punch to the gut. Even though I'd suspected, even though I'd pieced together the clues, hearing her say it, acknowledging the truth out loud, made everything feel devastatingly real. "Yes," I said, my voice tight. "I know." Another silence fell between us, and in that moment, everything we'd built, Every shared memory felt like it was unraveling, slipping through my fingers. I wanted to scream, to rage, to demand answers. But all I could do was stand there, watching the woman I'd loved, the woman who had once been my entire world, standing before me like a stranger. Why? I asked finally, my voice barely more than a whisper. Why did you do it? She looked away, her eyes filling with tears as she bit her lip, struggling to find the words. And then, finally, she spoke, her voice shaking with the weight of her confession. I don't know, she said, her words barely audible. I didn't plan for it to happen. It just did. Her answer felt hollow, empty, like an excuse rather than an explanation. I wanted something more, some reason, some justification that would make the pain easier to bear. But instead, all I got was vague regret, a weak apology that did nothing to undo the damage. I trusted you, I said, my voice breaking. I trusted you more than anyone. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she looked at me, her face contorted with guilt. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I didn't mean to hurt you. I never wanted to, but you did. I interrupted, my voice sharp. You made a choice, and that choice tore us apart. She looked down, unable to meet my gaze, her shoulders slumped in defeat. And in that moment, I realized that whatever we'd once had was gone, shattered beyond repair. The woman standing before me was no longer the person I'd loved, the person I trusted with my heart. As I looked at her, my mind flooded with memories. Our wedding day, the promises we'd made, the dreams we'd shared. And yet, those memories now felt tainted, poisoned by the lies and betrayal that had come to define us. I think you should go, I said finally, my voice hollow. She looked up, her eyes widening in shock. What? I can't do this, I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. I can't live with someone I can't trust. You need to leave. Her face crumpled, a fresh wave of tears spilling down her cheeks as she shook her head. Please, she whispered. Please don't do this. But her pleas fell on deaf ears. The love we'd shared, the life we'd built, it was all a lie, a fragile illusion that had shattered beyond repair. And as much as it tore me apart, I knew that there was no going back. She stood there for a moment, her face pale, her eyes filled with regret. And then, finally, she turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing through the silence, each step a painful reminder of the life we'd lost. As the door closed behind her, I felt a crushing emptiness settle over me, a hollow ache that threatened to consume me. The woman I'd loved, the woman I'd trusted more than anything, was gone. And all that was left was the shattered remnants of a life I'd thought was real. But as I stood there, alone in the silence, I realized that I couldn't let the pain define me. I'd lost everything, but I still had myself. And even though it felt like my world had crumbled, I knew that someday, somehow, I'd find a way to rebuild, to move on from the wreckage. It would take time, it would take strength, and it would take a heart that was willing to heal. But for the first time, I saw a glimmer of hope, a faint light at the end of the tunnel, guiding me toward a future I couldn't yet see. In the days that followed her departure, the house felt like a hollow shell. Every room was a reminder of her, of us, and every memory seemed tainted, heavy with the weight of her betrayal. I moved through the space like a ghost, trapped in a reality I couldn't escape, unable to fully process the loss of the life I thought I'd known. At first, I kept to myself, letting the silence close in around me. I avoided friends and family, unwilling to face their questions or sympathy. I wasn't ready to tell anyone what had happened, wasn't ready to confront the full impact of her choices. I told myself I needed time, that it was better to heal alone, but the solitude only seemed to magnify the pain. Mornings were the hardest. I'd wake up and reach for her, my body instinctively moving toward the warmth that was no longer there. The bed felt too big, the emptiness beside me a constant reminder of what I'd lost. I found myself haunted by memories of her. Moments that had once brought me joy now felt like knives in my heart, each one a painful echo of a love that had turned to dust. Some days, I catch myself going through the motions, trying to hold on to a sense of normalcy. I'd make breakfast, pour myself a cup of coffee, pretend that everything was fine. But inevitably, something would remind me of her. A song on the radio, a familiar scent, a stray item she'd left behind. And the illusion would shatter, leaving me raw and exposed. One evening, as I was sifting through our old photos, I stumbled upon an album from our first year together. Each picture told a story. A night out, a lazy Sunday, a milestone celebrated. Her face was everywhere, smiling, laughing, looking at me with an affection that felt painfully real. As I looked through those images, a wave of anger rose within me, hot and overwhelming. How could she have done this? How could she have thrown it all away for someone else, leaving me with nothing but these hollow memories and broken dreams? The anger felt cleansing, in a way, washing away the numbness that had held me captive. It was the first real emotion I'd allowed myself to feel since she'd left, and even though it was painful, it felt like progress. I decided to call a friend, one of the few people who knew what had happened. His voice was warm, reassuring, a lifeline I hadn't realized I needed. He listened as I poured out my anger, my grief, my confusion. And when I was done, he told me something I hadn't expected to hear. "You'll get through this," he said, his tone steady. "I know it doesn't feel like it now, but one day, this will be a memory, just a chapter in your story, and you'll be stronger for it." I wasn't sure if I believed him, but his words stayed with me, a small spark in the darkness. Over the next few weeks, I began to find solace in small routines. I'd go for long walks, letting the fresh air clear my mind, the rhythm of my steps calming my thoughts. I started journaling, pouring my feelings onto the page, allowing myself to process the pain in a way that felt real, tangible. There were days when the sadness would creep back in, catching me off guard, leaving me feeling as though I were drowning. But each time, I found it a little easier to pull myself back up, to remind myself that this pain wouldn't last forever. Slowly, I began to rebuild, piecing together a new life from the remnants of the old one. Friends reached out, coaxing me back into the world, inviting me to dinners, movies, simple outings that didn't require me to be whole or happy, just present. Their support was a balm, a reminder that I wasn't truly alone. And gradually, I began to feel a sense of belonging again, a connection to the world outside of my grief. One day, as I was going through some old boxes, I found a note she'd written to me, a small scrap of paper tucked away in an old book. It was a simple message, a love note from years ago, filled with words that now felt hollow, meaningless. But instead of feeling anger or sorrow, I felt a strange sense of acceptance. Her betrayal was part of my story, yes, but it didn't define me. I was more than this pain, more than the broken promises she'd left behind. As I stood there, holding that note, I realized that I was ready to let go, ready to release the bitterness, the regret, the sense of betrayal that had consumed me. It wouldn't be easy, and there would still be days when the memories would sting. But I was ready to move forward, to reclaim my life, to build something new. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. Months passed, and the pain began to lose its edge, becoming something quieter, more manageable. It was still there, like a scar that ached every now and then, but I found I could carry it without feeling weighed down. The world was no longer a hostile place, and I was no longer a stranger in my own life. I started to feel slowly like myself again. The house was still filled with remnants of her, small, forgotten things she'd left behind. A favorite coffee mug, an old sweater, a stack of her favorite books. At first, I wanted to throw them all out, to rid myself of everything that had once reminded me of her. But in time, I learned to let them stay, each one a quiet marker of a life I'd once cherished, a life I had learned to let go of. One morning, I found myself standing by the window, looking out at the quiet street, watching as the sun rose over the trees. The light was soft, warming the room with a gentle glow, and for the first time, I felt a sense of calm that I hadn't felt in ages. I realized that this was my life now, a life I had rebuilt from the ground up, a life that was mine to shape, to fill with new memories and new dreams. My friends were a steady presence, pulling me back into a world I'd almost forgotten. They'd been patient with me, giving me the space I needed, while reminding me that there was still joy to be found, still laughter to be shared. Little by little, I began to let them in, began to share in the small, simple moments that had once brought me happiness. One evening, I joined them for a night out, something I hadn't done since before everything fell apart. We laughed, shared stories, talked about the things we'd all missed. And in that laughter, in those shared smiles, I felt something shift. I felt a sense of freedom, a lightness that I hadn't felt in a long time. It was as if the weight of the past had finally lifted, leaving me open to the present, to whatever the future might hold. I began setting small goals, things I wanted to do for myself, places I wanted to visit, books I wanted to read, hobbies I'd long forgotten. I'd always wanted to learn photography, and one weekend, I bought myself a camera. I started taking walks with it, capturing moments of beauty I'd never noticed before, a bird in flight, a sunset over the hills, the way the morning light filtered through the trees. Each image was a reminder of life's quiet wonders, of the beauty that still existed, even in the wake of heartbreak. I also began volunteering at a local shelter, finding purpose in helping others. The people I met there, each with their own stories of struggle and resilience, reminded me that I wasn't alone, that I was part of something bigger than my own pain. The connections I made, the lives I touched, they became a source of healing, a reminder that I was capable of giving, of building, of creating a life that mattered. And slowly, I learned to forgive, not just her, but myself for holding on as long as I had, for doubting my own worth. I realized that forgiveness wasn't about condoning what she'd done. It was about freeing myself from the bitterness, the regret that had threatened to consume me. It was about reclaiming my story, about moving forward without being chained to the past. One evening, as I sat by the window, watching the stars, I found myself feeling something unexpected gratitude. Not for the pain, but for the lessons it had taught me, for the strength it had uncovered within me. I'd learned to stand on my own, to rebuild from the ashes of a broken dream, to find joy in the small, quiet moments of life. I didn't know what the future held, and for the first time, that uncertainty didn't scare me. It felt like an open field, a blank canvas, waiting to be filled with new experiences, new connections, new love. I knew that I'd love again, that I'd find someone who would cherish the life we'd build together. But for now, I was content, happy in my own company, at peace with the life I'd reclaimed. The journey had been painful, filled with loss, heartbreak, and betrayal. But in the end, I'd found something deeper, something stronger. I'd found myself, and as I looked out at the night sky, the stars shimmering in the quiet, I knew that I was ready. Ready to embrace whatever lay ahead, ready to move forward, carrying the lessons of the past with me, but no longer letting them define me. I was free, finally, and my life was my own again.